Hello race fans, my name is Taylor and welcome to Above the Yellow Line, the podcast where we talk about all the updates, theories, news, recaps, and more of the NASCAR Cup Series. Today's episode was going to be a half and half update of updates and then a pre-race podcast for the Pennzoil 400, but a lot went down today. A lot went down today in the NASCAR world, and I just cannot reasonably do an update and a pre-race podcast in one. It's going to take too long. So today is dedicated to every single update that's kind of come out in the past few days that's relevant to either this weekend or it does not completely have a relevance to a future race. So with this update, there is a lot to discuss. There's a lot of last minute Homestead stuff to just kind of package up. There's track updates, and there's also NASCAR drama, if you will. And this is, I think, the first time I'm diving into some NASCAR drama, some speculations I have. So stick around to the end of the podcast where I'll break that down. But let's start by talking about last minute Dixie Vodka 400 remarks, some closing remarks about the race. I really like talking about the viewership numbers for this race as it is a pretty obvious tell as to the interest the sport is bringing in and I guess how NASCAR is doing as a whole. The good news about this race is that the TV viewership for Fox specifically was the highest it has been since 2017. The race averaged a rating of 2.5 and brought in about 4.24 million views and was the highest viewed sport of the weekend. On top of this, I also love looking at social media's response to the race. In particular, Jeff Gluck has a Twitter poll that he puts out after every race, seeing how race fans like the race, if it was a good race or a bad race in their opinion. His poll showed that 78.1% of fans said that the Dixie Vodka 400 was a good race, and this rating is the third highest in his poll that it has been since 2016. So all in all, some very positive things there with the perception of this race. I know unexpected winners can bring in some views. As I said on the last podcast, this race was honestly just that good compared to the chaos of the 500 and the road course. So when I look at these numbers, they don't really surprise me, but I'm hoping that these races can continue to be as good as this one, or at least close to as good as this one was, so it brings more fans to their TVs to support the sport. Speaking of last week's race also brought up a lot of discussion around drivers to watch and a very interesting playoff picture that we see forming right in front of our eyes. A stat that I found kind of surprising is that there are still, I guess only 2 drivers that have managed to place in the top 10 for all 3 races so far. One of the names is no surprise, and the other name is an absolute shock. But I guess in a good way. These drivers are Kevin Harvick and your Daytona 500 winner Michael McDowell, who's kind of having a dream season, I guess. Kevin Harvick has placed 4th, 6th, and 5th at these past 3 races in that order, and Michael McDowell has placed 1st, 8th, and 6th for the past 3 races. Actually, if you do the math, giving them the same average finish of 5th place for all 3 of these races combined. Taking a driver like Kevin Harvick and Michael McDowell and trying to compare them is like comparing apples and oranges. It's just impossible, just where they came from, both their backgrounds, impossible. But seeing these numbers and how both drivers coming from different teams and do different capabilities, running equally well at the end of the race is pretty cool to see. It's very impressive. And at least for Harvick, both names have not been mentioned a lot so far in the season. There are so many drivers to cover, and for these two finishing in the top 10 every race, it hasn't been talked about a lot as much as other drivers, and it's kind of a shame. I know Kevin had a rough start to the races and is always able to close it out, hence his nickname, the closer. But I've been watching Michael McDowell all these races just to see how he's done, how he's faring against all these other teams, and he's been able to stay in the top of the pack virtually all the races. I am constantly reminded that even though a driver isn't talked about on the broadcast, that doesn't mean that they are unsuccessful. There's just another story or another, agenda to cover, which can make viewing a race from your TV a lot harder because you get a blip of the action, but at the same time, they can't cover all 40 drivers in one broadcast for a whole race. Heck, if I was at the racetrack, I couldn't even pay attention to all 40 drivers at once, but that also makes me actually miss being at the racetrack because you can get a wider view of what's happening and what's going on. So, I do miss being at the track. But my longing to be at the track aside, this discussion leads us to talk about the playoff picture with the 34 car of McDowell, which he's a part of, and the same with other surprise winners like Christopher Bell and William Byron as of last week. And seeing these drivers taking these spots in the round of 16 begs the question, will underdogs take the cake this year? And to that question, veteran and championship driver Martin Truex Jr. has a response. Truex is curious to see if this trend will continue according to an article on NASCAR.com, but he says, quote, "I still think the strong teams will end up being the teams to beat when it's all said and done." He has also commented about the rules package coming into play in terms of how the teams are getting closer together competition-wise, saying, quote, "The box that we work in is so small, and the longer we have the same rule package, the closer everybody is going to get." Quote from the NASCAR.com article, which I'll link right here. And he has a point. Hendrick Motorsports teams, JGR, Penske, they're not the top dogs for nothing. The veteran drivers and the multi-championship drivers are as successful as they are for a reason. But also to his point, the more time that the teams get with the rules package, which I think is going to change with the next gen car next season, which I'm not guessing it is going to change, the more time the teams have to figure out how to get their cars better week to week, and it gives the teams time, a chance to perfect their cars week after week until they pretty much have their process pinned down and perfect, which literally gives no team a room for error to be better than the other. It's just how the process goes. So I guess my question is it luck that these underdog drivers are doing so well at the beginning of the season? Is it the changing of the guard, as you will, or is it's something that the teams are doing? I honestly have no clue. These are just questions I have in my mind that I have no answer to. And I do think that we will start to see a trend for the next few weeks with the teams and get a better idea of who's the top dogs to watch this season, but I honestly could be very wrong, so we'll have to see. As I've noticed during these races so far, there is no trend that we are used to. We're seeing drivers that we usually see in 20th position, maybe 30th, in the top 15, less than the top 15 be in the front. So there's no gauge on who's going to be the best right now. We are going to another 1.5 mile track this weekend, the Pennzoil 400, which I'll get to in the next podcast. So maybe we'll see some trends starting then, but at the same time, I have a feeling we're not. So I'm hoping we'll start to see some trending things and we'll start to see who to look out for, but like I said, honestly, no clue. I could be totally wrong. Speaking of the top dogs of the sport, this Wednesday, March 2nd, the championship drivers Brad Keselowski, Martin Truex Jr., and Chase Elliott went to the Circuit of Americas to test tires for Goodyear. We're going to switch over to some track updates. This event that was closed to the public was to help determine the final tire combination for NASCAR's first weekend at this track in May. I'm not going to go into much detail about the track just yet, as I really don't want to bring up news that isn't relevant to specific races or teams until it's actually happening. But I can't ignore some of the driver responses, the hilarious driver responses we got to seeing these specific drivers testing at this track. And to that, I would say, before I show you some of the tweets, I get why you would want road course savvy drivers testing at these tracks. You want to give the tires the best chance possible to succeed, or you want the best minds on the track to give critical feedback on how the tires run so you can perfect them and get better. But at the same time, you also have some of the best road course drivers taking on the track that NASCAR has never driven on, at least the Cup cars have never driven on, and giving them a head start. Lots of drivers, like I said, have thoughts on this, and I'm in agreement with Tyler Reddick specifically, as he tweeted, "Yeah, let's give some of the best drivers on the road courses a head start over the rest of the field." And I mean, this doesn't bode well for other drivers. You see drivers like Chase Elliott trying to get a feel for the track early. You see Martin Truex Jr., who's pretty much Chase Elliott's rival on the road courses. I mean, at this point too, Christopher Bell, but he's not a championship driver in the Cup Series yet. He wasn't testing here, obviously, but you give them a head start and they're going to take it. So maybe not the best idea and not the best look to have the, like I said, best drivers on this road course testing out the tires, but also, like I said, who else are you going to have test the tires? It makes sense. At the same time, it doesn't. So that's Tyler Reddick's thoughts on the issue. And as we talk about the testing at Circuits of the Americas, there's news that just came out today about the Bristol dirt race and how that's going to work. I want to briefly mention here in this podcast before I go in depth with it during the actual Bristol dirt race weekend, but here's a very light overview of how this is going to work. The Bristol dirt race lineup will be determined by a series of what they're calling heat races that span a course of 15 laps each with a limited number of cars in each race, and the starting lineup for the actual race will be determined by how well the drivers do in the heat races based on their finishing positions and positions gained during the individual heats themselves. So it's going to be like an equation how they kind of start the races without practice or qualifying during the normal NASCAR season, I guess COVID NASCAR season. So Bristol is also going to stick to a 3-stage format for the actual race, but the pit stops will be different in the fact that they will not be able to add fuel to the cars, change tires, or work their vehicles at all between stage breaks unless involved in incidents. So that's also unlike anything that we've seen before. So lots to break down here at a later date, and there is still more that needs to be mentioned, but this is the skeleton of the breakdown for the Bristol dirt race. I wanted to briefly mention it today because the news came out big news, I guess, came out today. But I promise you I will discuss it more in depth when the weekend comes up. I just don't want to overwhelm everyone with information that's not necessary to know until the actual time comes up, because there is a lot to discuss today. The race is coming up pretty soon. It's March 28th, in a couple weeks. We don't have to wait much longer to get into the details of the race itself, but for now we're going to hold off a little bit until it's absolutely necessary. Now, the final discussion for this podcast is a big one that I have some opinions on. This is about some of the NASCAR drama that's developing in the sport or has been brewing for quite a while. So, diverting off the normal procedural and numbers talk I have on here, let's dive into some drama. It has come to question, more prominently as of recently, money, privilege, and NASCAR teams and driver funding and the behind the scenes of what goes on there. The whole discussion kind of kicked off big time last year, I guess 2019 now, when Tony Stewart made some bold, but in my opinion, very accurate and valid comments about how some of the teams intake their drivers and how some young drivers are getting into the sport, specifically kind of targeting Toyota and how they intake their drivers and how teams are taking in a lot of young drivers for some of the wrong reasons, meaning taking in drivers because of their sponsorship or the money that they have linked to their name, I guess, is how I perceived it. As far as the Toyota comment, Stewart was in talks of praising the Ford camp for their program of driver intake and preparing their drivers for doing a better job of guaranteeing them a ride for the future. As for Toyota, they seem to take in so many young and hopeful drivers and never have a spot for them in the end, and basically, in my terms, chewing them up and spitting them out. Not to say Toyota is bad at all, but the intake program over there leaves a lot of drivers without homes at the end of the day, as a statement by Tony Stewart kind of hinted towards. This statement also led him to talking about young talent, and I swear to you, I promise this talk about 2019 does have a point, so bear with me. It goes somewhere that's relevant to a tweet from today, so like I said, bear with me here. So Stewart said this about the young drivers being taken into the sport, and he said, quote, "They've got to get drivers that have personality. It's great to have opportunities to drive cars, but shoot, they're not even old enough to go to a bar. And they're trying to make these 18-year-old kids heroes." Tony Stewart also made this statement that is very relevant to the talk today, saying, quote, "There are hundreds of thousands of race car drivers across the country that have clawed and scratched their way at Saturday night short tracks and worked on their cars all their life to get where they are. Then you get kids with rich fathers and deep pockets that put them in their cars. All of a sudden, because they're 18 years old, they think they deserve to be in a cup car. I have a hard time with that. I think there are drivers out there with the experience and personality that makes race fans want to follow them. That's what's lacking in NASCAR." I'll put the link of the article in here because it's actually a really interesting read from autoweek.com. But his comment propels us to a more recent controversy after last weekend's Xfinity race at Homestead, where race leader Noah Gragson was wrecked out with 3 laps to go, I'll show you here, with a 9-second lead from David Starr. What happened was that Gragson was committed to the top line, and Starr, who was running 12th at the time, slid up the track after shredding a tire, which seemed to be the cause of all this, and Gragson just plowed into his car, into the bumper of Starr. A very unfortunate situation to which Gragson was extremely vocal at his dislike towards the situation, calling attention to the, in his words, dip blanks. I'm not going to say the actual word, but these drivers that are in the way of top tier cars, I guess, every single week on the track, and basically calling out drivers for their lack of talent. Noah Gragson has a habit of speaking before he thinks, as I know we can all get into sometimes, and that gets him in quite a bit of trouble with the fan base and with sometimes NASCAR. He took to social media, making his own posts about the frustrations of the night and commenting on other users' posts, slating more of his frustrations for the world to see in a not so professional way. He seemed to kind of have his frustrations managed, and then as the night went on, things seemed to spiral a bit. And like, I get being mad, but there's a smart way to be mad when you're in a situation, when you're in the industry of NASCAR, when you're trying to keep a positive image for yourself, and there's also a way to totally derail the situation. So just think before you post. That's all I'm saying here. I do really love Noah Gragson. I met him before. He's super great. He's very kind. He's very charismatic. But like any of us, sometimes anger and frustrations can get the best of us, and I get the social media tangents. I really do. It did get him in quite a bit of trouble here, though. Noah's vivid frustration led to a lot of backlash, leading team owner of the David Starr car, Carl longed to make comments towards Gragson, calling him entitled, pretty much. I'll show you the statement here. This statement coming from Carl Long Motorsports post on social media. The quote says, "This is the RF right front tire that came apart on David Starr while running 12th position on lead lap with a few laps remaining. The tread came apart as he dropped down to give Gragson the top lane. The car then slid up into the wall." This is where things get dicey. Gragson made a statement that we were, word I'm not going to say, that did not belong on the track. Well, this over-entitled mouthpiece did not have enough talent to miss our wreck. We were happy to take home a top 12 finish that rolled right out of our hands, just like the tire rubber rolled off of his tire. There are not many people left in this garage who have worked as hard and sacrificed as much as myself to get to this level. Statements like his could and usually does come back to cost him. End of quote. So there was a lot of frustration in that comment. Some things I agree with, some things I don't. I do agree with the fact that their team does work hard. There is a lot of teams out there that aren't given the respect and credit that they deserve based on, I guess, privilege aspects, money. We'll get into that after I talk about the main point of this conversation I'm having with you all right now. But I also want to mention that David Starr, the driver of the 13, had an interview with TMD discussing challenges that underfunded teams face, which ties into the earlier discussion about funding and younger drivers that Tony Stewart mentioned that kind of come into the sport with a face, name, and money, but they don't come in with experience at all, and how they are not as respected as other guys. Mike Joy tweeted about this interview and his take on the situation before he tweeted a big statement. We'll get to that in a second, but this is his tweet about David Starr in his interview, saying that he listened to the interview on TMD this morning. It was a great interview. He said, quote, "Very well spoken, illustrating the challenges underfunded teams face every race. I like he wasn't personally mad at his accuser, but was upset for his team and all their hard work and sacrifice being disrespected." So that was tweet number 1 from Mike Joy. And before we get into the meat and potatoes of this discussion, I guess, there is an obvious emotion from both sides of the argument here, and I don't know what was happening with David Starr's car and the time of the incident or what caused him to lose control at that exact moment. Could have been air, definitely probably was the tire as a majority of the issue that was caused. Timing works in odd ways and super unfortunate for Gragson, but the frustration probably was not handled the best way, and I don't want to discount the frustration from Gragson, the frustration from David Starr, but it caused a lot of drama and a lot of people woke up in the NASCAR community, including Mike Joy, who posted about David Starr in his interview and then followed it up with this gem that I'm about to show you that pretty much indirectly calls out Gragson based on the order of tweets and timing of this particular post. He spoke on the issue of funded teams and privilege. He goes, quote, "Our sport has always had funded drivers, but it is high time a few of these privileged kids powered by daddy's pile of cash realize this whole sport doesn't exist just to make their dreams come true. Take some time to learn from those who worked their way to the top." End quote. And with that, I'm like, mic drop. Mike Joy, mic drop. This tweet shook the Twitter NASCAR world. So the reason I led with the Tony Stewart comment back from 2019 is because it all ties in with entitlement and younger drivers coming in because they have the money behind them, they have the funding, but they don't necessarily have the skill yet. It comes in with entitlement, privilege that all these new drivers are bringing in, and it's not what NASCAR was pretty much founded on. NASCAR was founded on hard work and racing specifically, and I want to say that Mike Joy makes very, very valid points here. Lots of people on social media were discussing this tweet, and to Mike's point, the sport has always had funded drivers, meaning that there are drivers that come into the sport with bills already to their name or come into the sport with a financial backing. This is how I'm taking it. This is how I perceived it, and I'm sure that's how Mike Joy said it. There's a lot of points here that there are underfunded teams that are doing the best they can with what they have and are still making ground. Not every team is lucky to have a ton of money coming into their garages every week, but that does not make them any less hardworking or more important than a top-tier team. And I do understand that some teams are much more privileged than others for a specific reason. Money doesn't make you talented. Privilege does not make you talented or more worthy than the guy next to you. Attitude and work ethic do, and sometimes, if you're lucky enough, your work ethic will propel you farther than the guy who has a lot of money. And this goes with just regular life outside a racetrack too, I am sure. Working hard and hard work gets you farther than money probably ever will in the long run. With that said, I think too, against Mike Joy's post, though I agree with it wholly, times have changed, unfortunately. Work ethic doesn't totally get you as far as you need to in this sport. The glitz and glam does. It has changed, and in these ways, working your way to the top of NASCAR just is not the same as it used to be. And I hate that. I love NASCAR, but sometimes I feel like we forget about the heart of the sport and we have so much focus on the financial aspect, the promotion aspect, the drama, about the teams, and we forget about racing. Now, I know without sponsorship and money that NASCAR wouldn't be a thing. The teams need sponsors to run their cars every week, but that seems to be the main focus of NASCAR nowadays in the past few years, and I just miss racing. I miss the discussion around the cars, not about the funding. And to Mike's point, I want to see more work, and I want to see drivers that actually take the time and responsibility to learn and grow and not wait for opportunity to come knocking at their door. I want drivers to go and reach out for opportunity. And if there's anything I have learned about this sport, it's that big names were built off of the drivers who worked harder than any other. The names in the sport were based off of the drivers that dug deep and did the impossible. Dale Earnhardt comes to mind. Literally, Dale Earnhardt comes to mind. Jeff Gordon. All those top tier drivers worked their butts off. And these drivers that don't make it big are the drivers that skip the steps. They had big name sponsors and did nothing on the track. And this is not me calling anyone out. I have no one to call out for this. This is just me saying that everyone has their path. Everyone has their own story. Think before you act and put work that those do around you. And holy cow, I hope that makes sense. A little bit of a rant there, but this has been a big topic in NASCAR for the past few years. It started with Tony Stewart's comment a few years ago, and it's just been brought to light now with the past incident of the week. New sponsors, drivers pretty much searching frantically for sponsors in the truck series, at least. So it's been a pretty prominent topic. So with my opinion out of the way, I'm extremely curious to see what you all think about these comments, and if there's anything you can add to fuel this fire, or if you want to, what your take is on this situation. Let me know in the comments below. And with that, I want to thank you so much for listening to Above the Yellow Line, the podcast where we dive into all the updates, theories, news, recaps, and more of the NASCAR Cup Series. Today was a pretty different podcast for me now, going into the theory side of things. I usually don't do that. I'm very numbers and statistics focused. So thank you for sticking around. Next podcast is all about the Pennzoil 400, where we will actually dive back into the statistics and number side of things. It is a pre-race show, so stick around for that to discuss the race, the stats, and who has the best chance of taking that checkered flag. And until next time, I'll see ya.